So if you're designing a course, don't think, what do students need to know? Let the knowledge support the actionable learning objective. Let the knowledge and the information be used only in support of that objective. I did not care or even know enough to care about learning objectives when I first started teaching at the college level. So as a graduate student, I was given like a course in general psychology, which is my discipline, and even some advanced courses in theory and history of psychology. And so what I did was went to my library and started looking at all the books that I thought were most important. What does a student of psychology have to know? And I started like writing down names and assigning book chapters and articles, and I just kept going and adding more and more content. And then I would give lectures on topics that I thought were really important for students to know from my perspective. I remember in particular giving a lecture on like the application of Karl Marx to health psychology, because it was a paper that I was working on at the time, thinking that I was transforming these young minds into future scholars or something like that. But all the while, I was neglecting the most basic purpose of my role as a psychology instructor at my institution. And until I evaluated that and examined that, I wouldn't have known any better. But what I was doing was making up the rules as I went along without realizing that the courses that I was teaching actually had contracts. The contracts were in the form of course descriptions with actionable learning objectives that I didn't even read or I didn't really understand. I would list them on my syllabi or on each syllabus for my courses, but I wasn't actually doing them, nor was I assessing that. I was thinking, what sorts of assessments would be most helpful to teach my class the way that I want to, and sort of ignored what the goal of the class was. Which meant for those students, when they passed through my classes, they weren't being shaped into what the university was promising them when they paid their tuition, and what the university was promising the regional accrediting board that the students that went through those classes would actually achieve or accomplish. And so in this video, what I want to do is talk about how simple learning objectives are. There's a good chance that, like me, you're making the job of teaching a lot harder on yourself by ignoring the learning objectives that you're responsible for in a class. Let me say that one more time because it's really significant and the weight of it may not have been felt. If you were like me and not really paying attention to those learning objectives and designing your courses around those learning objectives, chances are you were doing too much. You were actually working harder than you possibly needed to. That if you organized your time a little bit differently and organized your courses a little bit differently in assessments and so forth, you would be doing a better job in the eyes of the university accrediting agency, again, possibly students. But you would also, I expect, would be doing less work. I'm guessing that at some point during this short little overview lecture, you're going to think to yourself, really? That's it? Like, that's all that I have to do? That's easy. And I'm hoping that is one of your takeaways. Now, what I'm going to do in this talk is mention a little bit about what an actionable learning objective is. So I'll talk a little bit about the definitions. But what I really want to do is focus on specific examples from my university. So that's Albany State University. I am the general education coordinator, so I'm going to be focusing on those general education outcomes at Albany State University. Now, general education course outcomes or learning objectives are so important because these are the core of what all students who pass through a university or get a degree, what they are all exposed to. So some students may go and study dentistry, medicine, business, accounting, psychology, nursing, whatever the case may be. They all have their specializations, but all of them pass through those basic courses. And so when you want to think about what is a university graduate, or what is an Albany State University graduate specifically, or whatever school you're teaching at. It's those general education courses that will represent it, or that will accomplish that. So that makes these enormously important. And you might be surprised to learn that there aren't a whole pile of them. There are only a small handful, and each course emphasizes one of those. And students take multiple courses in each area, so they're exposed to those same learning objectives over and over and over again, which means they should be really locked in by the time they get into their sophomore, junior, and definitely by their senior year taking those advanced level courses. So what is an actionable learning objective? Well, the key word here is actionable, or perhaps practical, or measurable, or demonstratable. The actionable component means that the student is performing some action. They're doing something. In this sense, learning is not a passive activity, or a passive process, rather. It is an active process. Students must be engaged in doing something. So I've got a list here of common learning objectives written in an active way and written in a passive way. And it's helpful to start thinking about them in the active sense, because this is what we're asking students to do. So for example, knowledge is a noun, but remembering something is an action. So do you know a specific date or a specific name? Yeah? Well, show me. Remember it for me. So the actual act is remembering. Comprehension is a noun, but understanding is a verb. Now, understanding can also be used as a noun, so understanding as a term isn't a very helpful one. I recommend, you'll see when I break this one down, there are 5 or 6 specific actions that represent understanding. Application is a noun. Applying is a verb. And so we don't want students to have application skills. We want to see them apply concepts to unique situations or novel situations. Analysis, I don't need to go through all of these. You can see the noun is on one column, those are non-actionable, and the verb is in the other column, those are actionable. So when you think about the learning objectives that you're designing your courses around, they should be action-oriented. You're asking the students to do something, and then the goal of that course is going to be to help students along with that process, so that at the end of the semester, they are skilled at doing it, and then hopefully the assessment asks them to do it, and then evaluates how well they've done it, or maybe they can even be part of that evaluation process. So I want to look at the list of learning objectives in my university's general education program. So I just have them kind of summarized here. They're much longer and wordier in the course catalog, but you get the idea of the action word in each of them. So we have divided our general education courses into 5 different sections, and each section is sometimes divided into 2. So for example, section A, we have the English, like the writing courses and the math courses. Students will learn how to communicate effectively with writing. Students will apply mathematical information symbolically. Communicate. Apply. So those are the key terms. In both of those courses, and again, this is the going back to the beginning part of what I mentioned, this is how simple those courses really are, or how simple the goals of those courses really are. To communicate effectively, or to communicate well through writing, is a lifelong process, of course. If you've ever spent a lot of time developing that craft, it's very difficult. But the goal itself is clear. It's simple. Students in this class will practice and practice and practice the activity of communicating themselves through the written word. If they're not doing that over and over and over again, then the course is misguided. It's headed in the wrong direction. It's organized around the wrong activities. Area B, we have demonstrating an understanding of diversity in communication. So those are 2 different subcategories there. Understanding is the action word, but remember earlier I said that's a little ambiguous because understanding can also be used as a noun. So our university decided to put demonstrate, so make sure there is an action there. They need to demonstrate their understanding, whether it be through a speech or through an essay or through some sort of project or product. Moving down to C, we have analyze, forms of artistic and social expression. That's our arts, music, and literature area. D, we have our lab sciences and higher level math courses. So this is demonstrating understanding the scientific method or applying mathematical formula. And then finally, analyzing human experiences. These are our social sciences. But what I really wanted to emphasize here was the key actionable term in each of them. Every area has its one thing that it's focused on. And if that area, the courses in that area are not emphasizing that action, then they're up to the wrong thing. They're focused on the wrong action. They're focused on the wrong activity. They're headed in the wrong direction. And from my experience personally, and then from evaluating some other faculty, some other colleagues, they're probably doing too much, not too little. I'm not trying to throw shade or kick dirt on instructors in general. Instructors are highly motivated. They're usually drawn to their field because of a passion, and they want their students to succeed, and so they spend a lot of time preparing their lectures and preparing notes and preparing assessments and activities, and they try to do all of this stuff without realizing, in some cases, that the goal is much simpler than that, and so they can do this much, but really focused around that one goal, that will be aiding the student in the long run, because when they take other courses, if they take a Gen Ed history course, for example, but have no plan of pursuing history, which at our university, we have a lot of history classes, but very few history majors. I don't want to criticize. I'm not trying to poke fun or anything at the history program. But most of those students will not go on to become historians. They're focused on, at our school, a lot of health professions is a really popular major. So the practice of, for that area, analyzing human experience, they'll be able to use that from a history course and then use it in their careers as nurses and so on. All right, so let's take a look at, in more detail, at what those action words mean or where they come from. So what I have here is a write-up of Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy. Now, there are several different taxonomies of cognitive processes or cognitive operations. The idea here is at the top, at least the way that I've organized them here, the top level is the simplest cognitive activity. So this is something that we would expect to find among children who are just starting to demonstrate cognitive abilities. And then at the bottom, we have the most advanced and most sophisticated cognitive activity. So you don't just jump from 1 to 6 in this example. You start with 1, you get really good at that, and you build on that with 2, and then build on that with 3, and then all the way down through the bottom. In college, you're focusing on the middle and bottom half of this. In maybe K through 6, you're focusing on the first few. So the top half. In high school, some advanced high school is probably the middle headed towards the bottom. So some of the most precocious students are already nailing evaluate and create on this list. In Gen Ed, at our school at least, I've put an asterisk next to those 3 emphases. So the Gen Ed courses, these are the ones students take in their first and second year primarily, are right in the middle of this taxonomy, and then their higher level courses will have learning objectives that have been built around those bottom 3 in particular. Graduate school, of course, emphasizes that last one, creation. So if you're doing a doctoral dissertation, you need to demonstrate that you can create something unique. You can build something that has never been built before. It's your contribution to the field. And so that comes at the very end. But it's been building over this entire taxonomy. So there are criticisms of Bloom's taxonomy, of course, just like any resource in education or any field. So it has its critics. Some people move them around, but whether or not evaluate comes before or after create won't really change the purpose of this lecture. So that would be a topic for another discussion. Now, to the right of this list of the taxonomy of cognitive operations, we see specific action words. And so I want to focus on those 3 with the asterisks because that's what I'm going to be focusing on later when I look at the general education courses at my university, Albany State. So with understand, which remember, understanding is a verb, but we also use it as a noun. Show me your understanding would be an example of using understanding as a noun. So how does a student demonstrate understanding? Through examples, interpretations, classifications, summaries, comparisons, explanations. Those are 6 actionable or 6 activities that emphasize this level of Bloom's taxonomy or this learning objective. If the goal is to demonstrate understanding, those are the activities that you want to design your course around. Moving down to application or applying, execution, implementation. Those are nouns. Executing, implementing. Now, what's the difference between those 2? One is a little more complicated than the other, and I'll go into those in more detail later. Finally, analysis or analyzing, breaking down into relevant basic parts. That's literally what analysis means. Differentiate and organize are 2 other examples. Now, how is organization different from classification? Well, you have to imagine that organization is built on classification, but it must be asking students to do something that classification is not asking them to do. And so I'll go into that in a little more detail further on. So if you're watching this and you're teaching a gen ed course and you're thinking about changing or developing your gen ed course in line with your learning objectives, you're going to want to focus on those 3 in the middle that I've gone over already, and that's going to be the emphasis moving forward. So I want to look at the actual learning objectives for the core general education curriculum at Albany State University. Just to give specific examples, there are 2 areas of our general education curriculum that emphasize understanding, called demonstrating understanding, and that's Area B and Area D. Area B we call our communications and diversity area, and then Area D is our lab sciences and mathematics area. Mathematics outside of the college algebra that everyone takes their first or second year. So this has like statistics in it, for example. So for Area B, students will demonstrate understanding of diverse peoples and cultures and communication. For Area D, students will demonstrate an understanding of the scientific method. Both of these are a little bit longer, and I guess I didn't write them out in their entirety. I think I'll look at Area C specifically at the very end, the whole thing. But in subsequent talks and in subsequent lectures on this topic, videos that you'll find, I'll go into detail, like I'll do an entire video on this understanding learning objective. I'll do an entire video on application, entire video on analysis, and I'll have the complete learning objective written out for those. So this is just to give a brief overview. For application, this is our Area A, so for math and writing. Students will communicate effectively through writing, will apply mathematical information. So communicate themselves, so that's an activity, and evidently it's something a little bit more advanced than demonstrating understanding, because I guess they have to have an understanding and then put that into words following certain rules of expression through exposition, and then applying mathematical information. Learning, I guess learning again is an ambiguous term, but memorizing or recognizing equations is different from being able to also recognize where they're useful, discriminate between which equation to use, and then apply it in a new situation, and recognize how that situation is a little bit different and what nuances that it has. So if you've been through a math class recently, or you teach math classes, you'll recognize that a big part of this is helping a student learn how to do a specific type of problem and then letting them do lots of them like it. So generalize that understanding to something else. The generalization of it is the application component. All right, the next one, analysis. So again, this is the most complicated of the general education learning objectives that we have at our university. So this is asking a lot of students, particularly during their first and second year. So whereas it may have been possible to do lots of activities at level 2 in understanding, you're thinking about much fewer activities but more time spent doing them when you get to this level of analysis. So students will, in Area C, analyze artistic and social expressions, music, writing, sculptures, and so on. Then in Area E, analyze human experience. Again, analysis is very difficult, but as a learning objective, it's simple. It's just practicing that process right there. How many different ways can we practice that process? What information is relevant to help students do more analyses or perform more analyses on their own? All right, the last thing that I want to do is, look at the breadth of the general education program. And I'm thinking that this will resemble most gen ed programs at universities across the country, right there in the middle, covering, strengthening those lower to mid levels of cognitive ability so that subsequent advanced courses or students bring that into those subsequent courses and really capitalize on the middle cognitive skills. All right, so let's look at one of those in detail. I've picked one of the more sophisticated, more complicated learning objectives, the analysis one, and we'll look specifically at, I listed several different courses here. So this is the learning objective as it's written in the course catalog. This is what the regional accrediting agency looks for when they evaluate our courses or look at the courses in this area. Students will critically analyze forms of artistic and social expression that reflect values from a cultural or an informed personal perspective. Now, the first thing that I want to do is focus on what the key actionable learning objective is there. And of course, analyze is that. Now, I've talked with some of the faculty in this department, and they don't like critically because to them, critically means reading a bunch of French, like continental French philosophy, and adopting this deconstructionist, philosophical perspective where you're doing semiotics. And I tried to encourage them to look at critical as drawing on advanced cognitive skills. So being critical is necessary when you're analyzing something. So that's the being able to differentiate between relevant aspects of an art piece or sculpture or a musical score. So that's the critical component. And then being able to pick that apart and explain it in a deeper level based on the breakdown that you've just given. So if that's the goal and you're teaching an art history course or a Russian literature course, instead of, so this is looking at how you might be doing too much by focusing on the learning objective. This is like reverse engineering. If the goal is getting students to practice this analytic skill or practice analyzing music or art or literature, are they being given lots of opportunities to do this? If so, what are they good at? What do they need more practice at? What sort of prior knowledge might be helpful to them? Design your course that way, rather than if you're designing courses the way that I designed my courses when I first got started, I was thinking, what do they need to know? Not what do they need to do or be able to do. The knowledge aspect, again, that's the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy. It doesn't require a lot of skill to memorize something. And in fact, if you look at statistics, students tend to lose, like the decline of that memory has a rapid drop-off as soon as like the semester's over or the exam has been finished or scored. So it's not that difficult cognitively, and it doesn't have that long-lasting of an effect. The learning objectives at the university level, and I'm guessing also at most K through 12 level as well, focuses on these middle to latter parts of Bloom's taxonomy, which are much more complicated, but they're also much longer lasting. So if you're designing a course, don't think, what do students need to know? Let the knowledge support the actionable learning objective. Let the knowledge and the information be used only in support of that objective, which means students should be practicing analysis as soon as possible when they get into your course if you're teaching a course with this learning objective. So a psychology professor, me for example, may not be focused so much on covering all of the names in the history of psychology, but might pick a few that will be relevant to students. So from my experience, students really like analyzing personalities, and they want to know what jobs they'll like based on a personality profile. So you might pick those psychologists that designed personality inventories and how they did so. The goal there isn't for them to recognize names. That's at one of the lower, well, I guess on the list, the top level of Bloom's taxonomy, which represented the least amount of cognitive ability or cognitive skill. Move them into where they're actually using it. They're using it to apply to their life situations, but then going one step further into the analysis. So what I'm hoping you get from this video is that course design and understanding activities, even lectures and assessments, is much simpler than you're probably making it. By beginning with learning objective, you can ask yourself, what is it that students will need in order to accomplish this activity? Once you've covered that base, let them start using it. And if they get it really quickly, awesome. You have just done what your university or your college is asking you to do, what the regional accrediting body wants you to do, and what you're being paid to, what you're contracted to do. Now, you might think, well, I've got 6 more weeks. I can just fill it with whatever. Sure, if you have additional learning objectives, you can emphasize those too. There's actually a lot of space in a semester to do multiple learning objectives, which is why sometimes there's program level learning objectives. But in a general education curriculum, there's one main learning objective for each of these courses. I've gone over what those are at my university. They may be different at your university. But that's the first, and that's like if one thing happens, it's that. But then there's all sorts of additional space and time to emphasize other learning objectives that maybe drew you to college teaching or teaching at the first place, or in the first place. Maybe it has to do with emotional awareness, or being grateful, or doing something for the community. Maybe it's ecological awareness, or understanding of diversity and equity. There's room for all of that within these programs, and perhaps I'll later do a video on integrating general education courses, which brings some of those additional themes into a bunch of courses in Gen Ed Core so that students are exposed to them as they take their courses. They're getting their learning objectives, but they're also getting something else, another theme that's important to a university. Hopefully, this was a good overview in terms of what a learning objective is and how they inform a class. In subsequent videos, I'm going to focus specifically on one action word for each video. So I went over all of them really quickly, but I'm going to spend time showing what a class might look like for each of those action words.